Hey everybody, Nick here from another BookTube channel, and today I'll be talking about the life and death of Fritz the cat, as well as his incredibly polarizing creator, Robert Crumb. First, a little bit of background for my audience members out there who maybe are not so familiar with comics history. In the 1960s, while mainstream comic books, such as those published by Marvel and DC, were being handcuffed by the Comics Code Authority, there was a counterculture of cartoonists who were leading the underground comics movement. Underground comic strips were deliberately subversive, featuring bad language, over-the-top violence, and sordid sexual acts on full display. At the center of this movement was Robert Crumb, whose prolific output and instantly recognizable style made him a bit of an underground comics superstar. The Life and Death of Fritz the Cat was published by Fantagraphics Books in the 90s, and it collects some of the best strips that Crumb drew featuring the anthropomorphic feline. While there isn't really a single continued story thread, they all are anchored by the frisky Fritz, a sleazy, hedonistic jerk whose primary goals appear to be getting high, getting laid, and contributing as little as possible to the world around him. In some instances, like the story Fritz the Cat, Secret Agent of the CIA, Fritz's seedy behavior is used to create an effective satire of James Bond movies, which were still new and very popular at the time. In the best strip of the book, and possibly one of Crumb's best ever, Fritz Bugs Out, Fritz eschews his studies for hardcore partying, burns his building down, becomes a fugitive, and plans to basically become a drifter. Most importantly to him, along the way he seduces as many women as possible by brilliantly manipulating them into thinking that he's a tortured soul with deep, profound musings on life. Crumb is a scathing satirist of all walks of life. Those who lean right politically would likely label him an anti-American commie, and those leaning left would probably call him a disgusting misogynist and racist. Crumb would likely disagree with both sides and just double down on the fact that everyone is fair game. This is where we get into the very, very complicated question of how can we appreciate Robert Crumb in the 21st century? As someone who appreciates the power and artistry of cartooning, I think Crumb is an absolute genius. His panels have a flow and energy to them that feels completely natural and almost rhythmic. He's a master at capturing the performance of his characters, with excellent depictions of body language and movement. Look at the opening panels of Fritz Bugs Out, for example. Let's take a look at just the first 5 story panels in Fritz Bugs Out, because I think that they perfectly exemplify Robert Crumb's mastery of storytelling, creating character through movement and body language, as well as his great handle of dialogue. So if you unfocus your eyes here, these panels could look pretty boring and pretty similar. They are all square panels of pretty much the same size, and they have the same basic construction of 3 characters in a row that are the same height or similar heights on the same depth of field. So how do you make that interesting? You don't want to just look at, 3 of the same figure, static looking boring. Well, this is how he does it. So if we take a look at the first panel here, the conceit is that Fritz's girlfriend has just broken up with him, and his friend the rabbit is trying to cheer him up, make him know that, it wasn't a good fit, you weren't right for each other anyway, let's move on. And the pig friend here, who's kind of being talked over, he just keeps saying, why don't we just get some booze and forget it? Let's get some booze and forget about it, huh? Let's get some beer. But they keep talking over him, and that's important for the punchline later. But in this first panel, they are very clearly walking towards the audience. They got their feet up, they are facing us, they are walking towards us, we could feel that movement. In the second panel, that movement stops. They're now standing, all their feet are flat on the ground, and Fritz is even leaning on this lamppost because he is dejected. He is woeful that his girlfriend has left him. And we get the body language from his rabbit friend as well. The hands up, like, what are you gonna do? You guys weren't right. and the pig being kind of sheepish. In the background, he knows that they're not really listening to him, so he just keeps repeating himself like, I just want to get some beer, let's go, let's go. The next panel, they start walking again, but it would be boring to just have them walk towards us because we've already done that. So now we're walking away from us. They're all still in the same positions, but we're still getting that movement, but now away. So it was towards us, stopped, now they've reversed, there's pacing, they're pacing back and forth. And in this panel here, they've changed positions, so we get more sense of movement. And this is where we get kind of a setup to a little punchline here. These are college-age kids in the 60s, so they have these, colloquialisms of the time that they fall back on throughout the story, and this is where that gets introduced. So we get this great rhythmic dialogue, and it's the first time so far that each character isn't talking over the other one. You can see here the word balloons are kind of butting up against each other or encroaching into their space, but now everyone gets their own singular line. And it goes, I'm hung up, strung out, uptight. And then in this final panel here where we get the payoff, it's the first panel where Fritz and the rabbit don't say anything, and the pig finally gets his say in, why don't we just get some booze and forget about it? It's a great rhythmic way of storytelling. It tells us about these characters. It tells us about kind of where they are in the friend group and which ones are, more important, which ones get kind of left out. It's just tremendous. I mean, all the movement, the body language, it's so good. This is brilliant cartooning, and it's even more impressive when you know that Crumb isn't sketching these out with pencil beforehand. He's freehanding these straight with ink in his sketchbook. That's simply not something that is ordinarily done, even by the most talented artists. A single image, sure, but a full 12-panel page with multiple characters and settings, that is straight up savant level stuff. I also think the satire and critiques levied by Crumb at society in many of his comics still rings true today. With Fritz the Cat, it was the free love movement that he took aim at, which modern audiences may not be aware of, and so may not appreciate it as strongly. Like Harvey Kurtzman's Mad comics in the 50s, many of the stories lose their punch over time as we distance ourselves from the original context. Some stories, however, gain more relevancy over time. In Hup number 3, Crumb writes and illustrates a story called Point the Finger, in which his cartoon self berates real estate tycoon Donald Trump for being a selfish, greedy scumbag. But Crumb's lack of confidence bleeds into the story, and he ends up finding that even when he's holding the pen, Trump's larger-than-life personality and his ability to talk his way out of trouble puts him in control of the comic, not Crumb. But even as someone who can appreciate the brilliance of the technique and his commentary, it is very hard to ignore the racial and misogynistic depictions in his work. I'm not going to show any examples here because honestly I just don't know what that'll do to this video in terms of burying it beneath the algorithm, but just know that it's not uncommon to turn the page in a Crumb comic and just go, oof. Crumb has defended himself a number of times out of necessity, saying that he didn't invent the racist caricature and that it was something that was part of the American culture that he was raised in. And so he used that caricature as a way to comment on racism. There is merit to that, and if you look back in comics history, Crumb is not exactly the first person to use racist shorthand in his imagery. That being said, it can be shocking to read these comics today and see them so bluntly using racist language and displaying racist stereotypes. In The Life and Death of Fritz the Cat, even though the characters are all animals, there is no shortage of this problematic behavior. Black people are depicted by crows, which I don't have to really explain to you why that's a problem. In the Fritz CIA agent story that I mentioned before, Chinese people are depicted by rats, and their L's and their R's are switched in their dialogue. It's It's really hard to defend, nor do I really want to defend it. It is awful, it's ugly, and it's inexcusable. I also don't want to gloss over the treatment of women in Fritz the Cat, as well as the rest of Crumb's work. It is no secret that Crumb uses his cartooning as a way to live out his fantasies of sexual perversion. In the 1994 documentary Crumb by Terry Zwigoff, Crumb admits that he would sexually gratify himself to his own drawings. For that reason, almost every Crumb comic features a fetishized woman, often much taller and thicker than the rest of the characters, but who almost always ends up being denigrated and dominated by a smaller male character. It's obviously Crumb working out his sexual fantasies on the page, and sometimes it can feel a bit gross just knowing why those panels are in there. Every female character in Fritz the Cat is just another object for Fritz to conquer. They are all easily manipulated, and even when they do wise up and kick Fritz to the curb, they end up crawling back to him anyway just to renew the cycle again. Again, this is a cartoon that is meant to satirize the men like Fritz during that free love 60s period, but in the process, it portrays women like they cannot think for themselves or stand up for themselves when they're being mistreated. So where does that leave us with Fritz the Cat and Robert Crumb? How do I reconcile the fact that I believe Crumb is a genius cartoonist with his problematic cartoons? Well, it's a cliche, but there is no easy answer. This isn't even really a situation of separating art from artist, because Crumb is very upfront about his art being a part of him or an extension of him. He has said that when a thought pops up in his head, he doesn't hesitate to put it down as a cartoon. He doesn't have that filter of, maybe this is a bad idea, maybe I shouldn't draw this, to stop him. And it's led him to creating comics that are both brilliant and disgusting, often all in one strip. I believe art needs creators like Robert Crumb to push the boundaries of what is acceptable and not, and to push us out of our comfort zones. I don't believe Crumb to be a man of malicious intent. I don't believe he writes what he writes and draws what he draws to inspire hate. Quite the opposite. I think he is trying to reveal hypocrisy in American culture so that we can better understand each other. It hasn't all aged well, but I do believe that intent matters. If you can find a copy of The Life and Death of Fritz the Cat secondhand, I encourage you to get it and decide for yourself. I also recommend the documentary Crumb, which does not shy away from depicting the artist as a kind of weird, gross person. What are your thoughts on Robert Crumb? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.